Just 70 years ago, a brave act was done by the pilots of the main Allied powers in World War II to bring supplies to the deprived people of West Berlin. Symbolizing the start of the Cold War, this event is the compromise to many conflicts of a world shaken with war.
Operation Vickles, we'll soon be on our way with coal and wheat and hay, and everything's okay. Operation Vickles, as in the sky we go, we won't forget to blow a kiss to Uncle Joe. We're growing fonder of the wild blue yonder, making the buck, flying the truck. Oh, dearie little, the job that must be done, although the war was won, we'll be there. Planning science and Mars, in our open cars, till the end,
Shortly before the end of World War II, the Big Three, which consisted of the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and the United States of America, met to discuss what would happen following the end of the war. They would decide future diplomacy and the fate of Germany in several conferences. The Yalta Conference took place in February of 1945, a couple months before the victories against Germany and Japan. In that conference, the Big Three would decide to partition Germany into several regions. There were several plans proposed, including ones by Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Henry Morgenthau. Finally, the countries decided to partition Germany under the Occupied Zones Plan. This would give back the regions conquered by Germany in the war back to their respective countries. Then the remaining parts of Germany would be occupied by the main Allied powers, Great Britain, America, the Soviets, and France. Berlin, the capital of Germany, would be deep in Soviet territory. The plan proposed to split up Berlin the same way as they split up Germany, resulting in British, American, and French enclaves in the Soviet-occupied zone.
3 years following the end of the Second World War, the first major international crisis of the Cold War had occurred. All roads, canals, railways, and other modes of transportation were blocked. Power was cut, water was cut, and West Berlin lay stranded in the middle of Soviet-occupied territory with an increasingly diminished amount of supplies. Furious U.S. officials began to worry as a panic began to set in as West Berlin's population grew concerned over the lack of food, water, and medical aid.
There's a significant difference between the people in East Berlin and the people in West Berlin. The people in West Berlin, in the area controlled by the military governments, managed by the French, the British, and the Americans, were receiving aid under the Marshall Plan. There was substantial financial resources, there were supplies and material that were brought in to help rebuild the city, which is still significantly damaged and destroyed from the aftermath of the end of World War II in 1945. The people in East Berlin, in the area under control of the Russian government, had not received any of those supplies. So their area had not been rebuilt, and a lot of East Berlin was still World War II vintage rubble.
Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, grew concerned about the recovery of West Germany. He had made it clear that the Soviets wanted a neutral, disarmed Germany that would never recover again, eliminating chances of another catastrophic World War III. On the other hand, the Allied powers desired for a rebuilt Germany, a strong, unified capitalist Germany that wouldn't fall prey to the Soviet Union policies of communism and would be a good trading partner for the British and Americans. These differences only grew as the Allied powers stopped shipments to East Germany and later combined their sections to form West Germany on June 1st. Negotiations between the British, Americans, and Soviets completely broke down on June 22nd, 2 days before the blockade.
Many factors came into play before they finally provoked Stalin to start the blockade. The first of which occurred in January of 1947, the creation of Bizonia, the region where Britain and America joined their territories. This made Stalin realize that the Americans and British were actually making a strong, unified Germany, which made Stalin mad. Second, the United States voted for the Marshall Plan, which was a plan to help Europe recover from the wars it had been through by giving Western European nations money and food. Again, this infuriated Stalin because he thought this was an attempt to undermine Soviet influence in Europe. In retaliation, Stalin started stopping and checking all cars and trains going into Berlin. Then, France added their territory into Bizonia, creating West Germany and West Berlin. The Marshall Plan introduced the Deutschmark, a new currency, into West Germany on June 23rd. Then, other Eastern European countries wanted to use the Deutschmark since they thought it was worth more money than the Soviet currency. The next day, the Soviets blocked all roads, rails, and canals leading into West Berlin. The Soviets saw the British and Americans trying to get control and relations with European countries, so they retaliated by trying to take Berlin. The Allied military forces in West Berlin would be surrounded 62-1 by the Soviet forces outside in East Germany. The vital supply lines of food and fuel that the undernourished Berliners depended on would be cut, leaving them with only 36 days of food and 45 days of coal. Truman and his cabinet would find three main options to pursue. 1. American forces could withdraw, but that would show the world that Soviet aggression is more powerful than Western democracies. 2. They could stall it out until the starving people would force the Allied troops out and accept the Soviets out of desperation. Lastly, they could send an armed group of transports, but that would be considered an act of aggression and give the Soviets a reason to declare war. Truman's cabinet advised Truman to retreat, but Truman said, "We stay in Berlin, period." Truman saw another option. Months earlier, the Soviets had stopped traffic temporarily, but the Allies continued supplying Berlin by air.
During late March of 1948, the Soviets ordered that military and passenger traffic between the American, British, and French occupation zones would be stricter, harsher, and more restricted. After these new guidelines were enforced by Soviet officials following the start of April, Soviet soldiers would search all road and rail traffic to Berlin. Any cargo or military personnel would need permission from the Soviets to pass through East Germany. American General Lucius Clay ordered cargo to be transported by air instead. Later this was called the Little Lift by Americans. The restrictions eased after a week, and cars and trains continued to deliver supplies. President Truman thought that a similar airlift, but larger, could supply all of West Berlin. The British Royal Air Force, or the RAF, thought this was a feasible idea because they had learned how to ration food through all of their food shortages throughout World War II. Together with the help of Lucius Clay and Truman, they calculated that at least 4,000 pounds of food and fuel would be enough to sustain the people of West Berlin. So he had planes leaving every few minutes to fly, land, and quickly unload in Berlin before quickly flying back to get ready for the next shipment of supplies. They were able to manage this for a while, but the tight schedule and old planes hindered their progress. They replaced the old C-47s with C-54s, which provided lots more room and overall worked better. The airlift lasted until May of the following year, when on the 12th, the Soviets finally removed the blockade, and British supply convoys flooding through, providing to the people of Berlin. Even though the blockade ended, it doesn't mean that the airlift did. Supplies still were being brought in by plane to bring the economy back up. The airlift officially ended on September 30th, 1949.
The media was a big factor in the airlift. People like Gail Halvorson, otherwise known as the Candy Bomber, helped gather PR and gain support for the airlift. Halvorson would drop packages of candies for children when he would fly by. This encouraged people to send things like care packages. People like mechanics even flew to Berlin to help out with the cause. One of America's most favorite songwriters and singers, Irving Berlin, flew out to Berlin with other entertainers to perform for the pilots and military of the Berlin airlift. One of these songs was known as Operation Vittles and helped to bring attention to the cause, therefore helping the airlift.
The Berlin airlift was a successful operation by the Allied powers in trying to help the people of West Berlin. Although 2.3 million tons of food and fuel were delivered to the wrongly deprived people of West Berlin, over 100 pilots' lives were lost in the process. In addition, this increased global tension, leading to the formation of the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO. a tense global atmosphere after a major war erupted into political conflict as a provocation to the Western Allied powers. Luckily, this one-sided compromise saved the people of West Berlin from the horrors of the communism, starvation, and famine.